Welcome everybody to the College of the Atlantic. This is Deering Common. It will always be known to me as Riles. I'm the president, Darren Collins, of the college, but I'm also an alum. I graduated in 1992, and for me this will always be the Riles building, because I lived in the servants' quarters that used to be on the south side of the island. And as students, we all knew it was haunted, so just be comfortable with that. But we also knew, or we thought, that it had this, the infrared beams running across all the floors. So both the hauntedness and the beams kind of kept us from trying to sneak in, but we definitely wanted to. This is the Sherry Geyelin lunch, and both Sherry and her husband Philip were preeminent storytellers. And we have another one in Brad today, and I'm not going to read Brad's biography. You all know him much better than I do, and plus everything is nicely laid out here. But what I came away from when I read Brad's work is that he is a great storyteller, and what his magic to me meant was taking things that could sometimes seem quite mundane and common and making them really, really magical. And that is something that a good storyteller can really do. So we're excited to have you here today, Brad. We congratulate you on your book coming out in 2014. And we welcome you all to the college and to this lunch. Thank you. Yeah.
And can everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. There was some debate. Louder? Is this good? Okay, there was. Writing a book turns out not to be nearly as easy as I thought it was going to be, because before I started I knew everything, and now I'm discovering I know nothing. So I'm going to share some of the nothing I know with you, or some of what I don't know with you. The book is supposed to be about the houses of the Downeast coast from Camden and Dark Harbor to Winter Harbor. And I'm currently in the throes of writing the introduction, and it's very hard because, of course, I try to find a common theme about what makes a Maine summer house and what makes it interesting. Some of the finest architects in the world have worked in Maine over the years. And of course, if I were to ask people what makes a Maine house, what makes a Maine summer house, most people would say a big gray shingled house, lots of wicker on the porch, not too fancy. And of course that is the standard idea. But other things happened. And this theme is constantly, I find a war of themes. Because of course in the middle of all of that, you have Bar Harbor, which was once one of the big stops on the international social circuit. Now it's one of the big stops on the international cruise circuit. And my head is so full of information these days that trying to decide what not to say to you is much harder than what to. For example, in the last 6 months, I have read through 50 years worth of the Maine social columns for 12 weeks every summer in the New York Times from 1882 to 1938, when they decided that Bar Harbor was no longer important enough to cover. And so, chances are, if your grandmother gave a dinner party in 1932, I know who was there, and I know what the flowers on the table were. Really, ask me. And all this in service of finding out a few simpler things. I keep hoping, because a book for Acanthus Press, for whom I'm publishing, should ideally involve architectural history, social history, and interior design. And because Maine has always been such a modest and private place, there's not as much information as one would hope. So I keep scanning the New York Times social columns, hoping that I will discover that Elsie de Wolfe came to Maine and did an interior in Bar Harbor, Northeast, Winter Harbor, wherever. And of course what I instead find out is that she hated Maine and turned down all jobs that she was offered. So I keep plowing ahead. And we'll start. This is Isle Ho. Isle Ho was designed to be the un-Bar Harbor. Every summer colony up here started about the same way. first an artist came, then a hotel was built, and then people started staying in the hotels and decided they'd like to stay longer and started building cottages. This all started pretty much in the 1870s and was well underway by the 1880s. And by the way, in the book I'm covering 1880 to 1940, which were the great years of development. Idaho was developed by a member of the Bowditch family. He was determined it not be as fancy as the other resorts, and I guess it isn't. But everything is relative. This is a cottage in Winter Harbor. Winter Harbor is at the other extreme. It was all built overnight, literally. In 1893, in 1891, a man bought the land, had it laid out in lots by Nathan Barrett, hired an architect who would build the houses for the new people, and in 1892 and 93, all the houses there were built overnight.
By the same architect?
By the same architect, mostly, a little later. And this one is how it appears today. The architect's name was Lindley Johnson. And as I plow through, I find other things. I keep asking the question, what's the common theme? And of course, every so often some wise guy will raise his hand and say, Philadelphia. But in fact, everybody got to come here. This is a cottage in Castine. It was built for Colonel A.K. Bolin, who owned a steamworks in Brooklyn, New York. Classic shingle-style summer cottage. And finally, I began to find things that interested me. This is an interior. It looks like a Maine summer. Someone had the bright idea of putting up a parasol for decoration. And, it fits perfectly in the moment. And I was delighted with this photograph. And then I found the next, oh no, that's not the next photograph. We're going to talk a lot about the servant problem today also. This is Colonel Bolin's niece, who inherited the house with her major domo, who was also her principal heir. And they've obviously been out having a nice shoot. This is the house, I've lost a photograph. This is the house after good taste set in and the parasols were swept away. This is a recurring theme. I find many questions as I go. For example, why were no big houses built in Bar Harbor after 1926, but for one? Everything was remodeled. In Castine, likewise. There it is. What happened is that apparently they liked their parasol so much they did it in every single room.
Oh my gosh.
That's great.
Did it have any function?
I think it was purely decorative. There was a great fascination in the 1880s and 90s with Japanese motifs. But then there are the aberrations, the houses that aren't gray shingle. This is also in Castine on the hilltop beyond, and it was designed by William Lawrence Bottomley, who was best known as a Georgian Revival architect who designed a lot of very handsome houses around Richmond, Virginia, and Long Island Hunt Country. And so, escaped from Palm Beach, we have a very Meisner-esque Spanish house with suitable interiors. Moving over to Blue Hill, we find, amidst all the gray shingled cottages, we find a full-blown Tuscan villa. Mrs. Ethelbert Nevin, widow of a then famous composer, for those who have said, Ethelbert Nevin, never heard of him, built this house to remember her happy years in Venice. It's Tuscan, I know, doesn't resemble Venice at all, but everything. She did have a model of the house in Venice in her drawing room, and created wonderful Italian gardens looking out to Blue Hill Mountain. Music room, fireplaces, one at each end, inscribed with lines from Nevin's compositions. An amusing footnote, the 17th century harpsichord was stolen from the house in the 70s, and the Nevin grandson, who then owned it, didn't recognize it when it was finally found. He had been looking at it all his life and said, "Is that my harpsichord?" In San Francisco. And no matter how Italian, Maine still will out in the end. This is the library at the Nevin House, typical Maine cottage. And of course there are some fascinating houses along the way. This is a house built in Phippsburg in 1808. And it's one of Maine's finest Federal era houses. In the 1920s, a Mr. Dodge from Philadelphia decided he wanted a true Federal house and went shopping and found this one in Phippsburg, where it was called Spite House. Spite House because it had been built to be grander than the stepmother's house, which the stepmother had inherited across the street. And anyway, Mr. Dodge had it rolled down to the shore, loaded on a barge. It was much easier moving buildings in those days. And had it floated up to Rockport from Phippsburg and wildly enlarged into his fantasy of the Federal era in Maine. The architects were Tilden Register and Pepper of Philadelphia, who did a lot of work here on Mount Desert also. The dining room, fearless color schemes, orange and blue carpet, orange curtains, orange and blue wallpaper, very beautiful room. And then, of course, the reason I'm going to 1940 is because some of the best modern houses in America are in Maine. This, of course, you recognize as Fortune Rock at Soamesville, and a wonderful George Daniel photograph of the builder, Clara Fargo Thomas, on her deck. Absolutely superb building, one of the best modern houses, best houses of its era. And then I keep looking at floor plans, almost to the point where I'm dizzy considering the service arrangements of late 19th and early 20th century houses. This one is Thirlstane, one of the most famous houses in Bar Harbor, one of the epical shingle houses. It's worth noting that the shingle style was pretty much invented here in Maine, and some of its best examples. But by the 20s, the Jazz Age was roaring in, and the shingle style was old-fashioned, and William Pearson Hamilton, a son-in-law of J.P. Morgan, a former son-in-law of J.P. Morgan at that time, bought the house and did what everyone did then, which is have Beatrix Farrand come in and design new gardens, and gave the house a colonial makeover, which you can see in progress here. In the late 19th century, Bar Harbor was published in all the architectural journals regularly, and as I look through them, I keep finding things, because I'm trying to find houses that will interest my readers, will, give an idea of the great variety behind the idea of summer in Maine. And at Left Center, I decided I liked that house a lot. And I finally, after months, found a photograph of it. And that's it. It burned 4 years after it was built, next door to Thirlstane. And for those wondering, that slightly scary outside staircase, I happen to have a little problem with heights, goes to a smoking room. So the after-dinner cigars were well away from the drawing room or the dining room. Exactly. And then another shingle house. This is by William Ralph Emerson, no relation. And it was built for Mrs. J. Montgomery Sears, whose husband was a Boston businessman who was head of, I think, the Puritan Syndicate in the America's Cup in the 1880s. And it was a commodious, comfortable house, not one of Emerson's best works, not one of his worst. And this brings me to another question that I have to answer if I ever expect to get the book written, which is that Bar Harbor was considered second to Newport on the American social circuit in the 1880s to the 1920s, but it never was as elaborate as Newport. And of course, part of it is our simple Maine thing, but why were there no limestone and marble palaces built in Bar Harbor? Grandeur is a relative thing. I mean, there's Versailles, there's everything else, but we don't know. That's Mrs. Sears and her lovely portrait by Sargent. Oops, do you want more? Yes. And Mrs. Sears's garden, as published in House and Garden in the early 1900s, she decided she wanted a garden more than she wanted a tennis court, and so this one's size was described. But then Mrs. Sears decided to move across the bay to Gouldsboro, which in search of a simpler life than Bar Harbor's. And a mining tycoon from Montana? I'm sorry, facts sometimes elude me. Bought the house for his daughter, who is pictured here. Her name was Evelyn Walsh McLean. Her husband was the publisher of the Washington Post. Thank you. And she, of course, was famous as much as anything for owning the Hope Diamond, which she wore every day, all day, even here in Bar Harbor. And two Pinkerton detectives came up on the railroad car with her. You know, she was not just roaming around unguarded with that big thing around her neck. But there is a story, probably apocryphal, and this is the other hard thing about writing a book. Sometimes the best stories turn out not to be the true ones. But a movie was filmed in Bar Harbor during the silent film era called Goddess from the Sea, and it starred Annette Kellerman, the Olympic swimming star. And apparently, as the story goes, Mrs. McLean loaned the diamond as a prop for the thing, and that there was one moment where it was nearly lost overboard. True or not, I don't know, but the story has gone through. And that brings us to the lack of Newport-style houses in Maine. This is a design for a house by John Russell Pope, who later would design the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery. And he apparently designed it for Mrs. McLean, who before she discovered she didn't like Bar Harbor, and really did prefer Newport anyway. And so instead of building this lovely French chateau, she remodeled the old Briar Cliff and doubled it in size, but you know, nothing. But it had many other wings. Here we have Bar Harbor Society watching Queen of the Sea being filmed. It was a simpler time. We were all easier to entertain. And within, connecting the many wings of the house, was a courtyard. But Mrs. McLean was a spendthrift, and the money didn't exactly run out, but there wasn't enough just the same. And the house was pretty much abandoned for taxes in the 1930s. By the 1940s, a ballet school was in residence, and these are photographs from Life magazine of the courtyard in the center of the house with dancers posing amidst. I'd love to know who he is. I just, you know, some things just refuse to be found out. And by the 1940s, Briarcliff was getting shabby. And of course, World War II, the servant problem, the Depression, everything took a toll. Fashion had moved on from Bar Harbor, and people who stayed here were trying to think what they could do, and reducing the house was off the thing. Did I mention, by the way, that this was Nelson Rockefeller's birthplace also? I mention only because I got this photograph from the Rockefeller archives where it was taken to commemorate that fact. And so the house was cut in two, and that's what was left. And for a few years that sufficed. Then the Bar Harbor fire dealt a death knell, and all that's left now are little wings of the house. The McLean's bowling alley at the upper left, their music room at the center, and part of the servants' wing, all as separate houses. And so, big events happened in Maine. This is Chatwold, a house built for Louise Livingston Bowler. And it was designed by Roch and Tilden, prominent architects of the day. It was widely published in the architectural press, much admired. There's a photograph of the stair hall. And this is, you know, grand by Maine standards, but not necessarily. But in 1895, Chatwold was purchased, of course, by Joseph Pulitzer, publisher of the New York World, and his wife, a niece of Jefferson Davis. And it was not enough for them. And Mr. Pulitzer, who had a nervous condition which required absolute silence much of the day. He was also going blind. Added a tower, which you see to the right. It was designed by Stanford White, the only building in Bar Harbor that McKim, Mead, and White did. Another question is, why did they not get many Maine commissions? And this tower, his yacht was where he found the greatest silence. This tower had a lot of things. The other thing I discovered is the bar for luxury keeps moving. The ground floor of the tower had an indoor swimming pool fed by the ocean and heated by steam. And in 1895, that was an extremely decadent thing. That was a big, big deal. Now we don't think twice. The next floor was a 40 by 40 library for Mr. Pulitzer. The next 2 floors were for his assistants with whom he could never be without. And the top floor was his bedroom. The walls packed with steel wool, the floor on ball bearings, all to try to make it very silent. And effectively, the Pulitzers ran 2 households, Mr. Pulitzer's in the tower and the rest of the family in the main house. And in 1907, I'm sorry, this is the problem with talking extemporaneously, he summoned his secretaries who thought he was safely in Bar Harbor for the summer and that they could have a little relief at the world offices. He summoned them all to Maine and said, I've had an idea. All of you get down here. And he dictated his idea. That idea is now known as the Pulitzer Prize, which was born here in Bar Harbor. And there's a closer view of the tower. By 1938, the house had gotten too big for the Pulitzer family and the tower was torn down. And then a few years later, Joseph Pulitzer Jr. wrote a friend a letter saying that he had decided to tear down the entire house as the age of the Summer Palace was over. This was in 1945. Architectural elements were stored in anticipation of building a new house, but the Bar Harbor fire took out the stable they were stored in and gone. There's the house without the tower. And there, I'm going to digress for a moment, because as I said, there's a servant problem. There are loads and loads of talented servants. There's the loyal butler who always knows which drink you're going to want once you're through the door. And then there are the naughty ones. And the Pulitzer's housekeeper wrote Mr. Pulitzer's head secretary about housekeeping problems at Chatwold. The appearance of the pink drawing room is at this hour a disgrace to a first-class housekeeper. So I walked to and through the housekeeper's forbidden ground, namely the dining room and butler's pantry, to find the second footman, who it was agreed between the butler and myself should daily care for the pink drawing room, while the third footman cleans the yellow drawing room and main hall and stairs. I find instead the family butler engaged in the dining room, but the third footman, who ought to be cleaning or at least tidying the pink drawing room, set to sweeping the dining room for our lazy family butler. The first footman cleaning silver and the third washing and wiping dishes. This arrangement in order that the 5 men hurry through the dining room work to allow 2 to do nothing for a couple of hours before luncheon is served. In my censure, I do not include Mr. Pulitzer's butler, who must have free time, but the incapacity of the family butler and the stolid indifference of one of the footmen. It is impossible for me to send either of the chambermaids into the drawing room during the forenoon, and I neither can nor will do a parlourmaid's work properly apportioned to a footman that he might lay down in the chambers and smoke cigars in the middle of the day. That's one angry housekeeper. And this is Mrs. Joseph Bowen. She was, by all accounts, a very nice lady. She was a philanthropist. Hull House in Chicago existed greatly through her generosity and her friendship with Jane Addams. She built a colonial-style house at Hall's Cove, and after a few years decided that she wanted gardens. And she, hired a gardener, and he started planting, and she discovered he was colorblind. And that wouldn't do, we don't want orange flowers next to the blue flowers ever. I feel guilty myself when it happens. And all was well. She imported another gardener from Scotland, trained at Wisley and ready to do her bidding. He created a yellow garden in the lower left and a beautiful rose garden at the right, so all was well again. The first gardener had insisted on so many greenhouses that she decided one of them should be a swimming pool instead. And that, of course, the other swimming pool is directly on the beach at Chatwold, and that brings, of course, you know, the change in labor. It took, pardon?
Is this baby?
This is Baby.
Yeah.
And it took 6 men with a mosquito net to drag the lower swimming pool every day, you know, long before pool vacs and everything. Jane Addams lived next door at this house. And guess what? Mrs. Bowen had trouble with her men servants too. On one occasion, when we were having a smaller entertainment at the house, there was a terrible noise in the pantry, and your grandfather went in at once to see what it was and found to his utter astonishment that the 2 butlers had been fighting, and they stood each with the other's wig in his hand. One had a toupee and the other had a full wig, and your grandfather was so convulsed by their absolutely bald heads that he just looked at them and said, "Stop fighting," and walked out. Other interesting people, of course, show up here. This is Reverie Cove, a house designed by the Bar Harbor architect Fred Savage. And it was owned in the early 1900s by the Mrs. Hewitt, Eleanor and Sarah, who founded the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and whose special interest in collecting textiles there are the Mrs. Hewitt. It shows itself in their drawing room, which is hung with 18th century Indian palampour. And back to men servants. This is Mrs. Miles Carpenter of Hauterive with her butler. As you notice, they are not really having a warm moment. The butler's name was Adams, and he was by all accounts a model butler. Remembered everybody's name, took care of all the things he had to do. But one day, while in the Carpenter's New York house in the fall, he overheard Mrs. Carpenter changing her will and leaving him less money, and that evening set fire to the tapestries in the dining room. Hauterive was one of Bar Harbor's loveliest houses, but it didn't start that way. This is it as originally built, and after the Carpenters started building gardens. It was published in Country Life in 1911. The fountain is 17th century and was imported to Bar Harbor. And you're all familiar, I'm sure, with Eric Soderholst, the wizard of concrete garden sculpture. He built the wall behind the fountain. Later on, the Stotesburys bought the house next door and built such a large servants' wing that ran so close to the Carpenters that they took down their old small garden wall and built this one, which is about 10 feet tall, reusing the fountain, as you see. It was a lovely garden. Their croquet lawn. And a party on the croquet lawn, you know, in one of those halcyon summers. And the same view today. We aren't necessarily making the world a prettier place. Her Persian garden. And isn't that wonderful? The carpenter's daughter, who lived in the house until 1960, was a clothes horse. She was dressed in Paris, Poiret, Worth, Vianney, and many of her clothes are now in the Costume Institute. She was also fascinated by all things Persian and had Mr. Soderholst create these concrete Persian gates to her dock. And apparently, these are some of her clothes at the Met now. Magnificent fan, don't you think? And there are constantly unanswered questions. The Metropolitan has a wedding dress that Miss Carpenter donated. And one wonders, is it Miss Havisham? What happened? You don't, one doesn't know. and she saw no inconsistency in having her Persian gates go to her French dock pavilion. Along the way, and start shifting your seats if I'm going on too long, because I can stop at any time. This is the Building of Arts in Bar Harbor, and I've included this for a moment away from the servants because along the way I find interesting things. It was designed by Geyelin, who was a fashionable architect at the time. He did the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and George Vanderbilt and Susan Whitney Dimock donated the building. And though it was a critical success from the beginning, it was not a financial success. And when George Vanderbilt died a few years later, his stock, in which he had paid $14,000 for in 1907, was deemed worthless by his executors. Not much in an arts building. But it was a lovely Greek temple. And this is not a performance. This is back in the good old days when people loved to put on tableau vivant. And we have several records of tableau vivant held here. This one is a Greek pageant. And unfortunately, I don't know who the people are in the photograph, but the New York Times does record in general who they were. And there they are again.
Where is this
So
located?
it was at the edge of Keble Golf Course. I'm sorry, I don't know Keble well, but I think it's the 9th green was also the amphitheater. And of course, since it was that era, for example, Greek plays would be held and you'd get one line about the Greek play and then 3 paragraphs about who was in the audience. But everybody went there. The opening performer was Emma Ames, one of the great sopranos of her day. Paderewski played there. And most astonishing to me, these are the Washington Square Players at a beautiful room. Flower shows were held there, concerts, it was used. President Taft golfed nearby, but there's no record that he attended a performance. Yes. And as you see, the audience is more important than the play. But the hair standing on the back of your neck moment was discovering what isn't unknown, it's not something I amazingly discovered myself, is that in 1916, with war in Europe, many European artists remained in America, including Nijinsky. And Nijinsky came to Bar Harbor that summer. And he was already beginning his descent to madness, but Diaghilev sent him up here. He stayed at the Malvern Hotel, where he was seen by Mrs. Meyer Davis dancing a gavotte at the back of the ballroom at the Malvern one evening. And his set designer and assistant choreographer were sent to Bar Harbor with him. And the sets for Till Eulenspiegel, his last ballet, the costumes were all designed here in Bar Harbor, and his rehearsals were. This is the Fabry house on the Eden Street shore. A very stable life was lived there. Mrs. Fabry built it in 1903, rebuilt it in 1917, and lived there until her death in the early 50s. Next door, next door was Sonergy, one of the most famous houses in Bar Harbor. And Sonergy was as restless as Mrs. Fabry's house was stable. And Sonergy was built for Henry Lane Eno, who owned the Fifth Avenue Hotel. He had financial reverses, moved to England, sold the house to Lyman Kendall, a socially ambitious stockbroker, and his wife, who was the daughter of the governor of Montana, Utah, Wyoming. And they had the house redecorated in true Newport style, but she let it be a hospital during World War I for recovering soldiers, and she fell in love with one of the soldiers. And so it was the big divorce of the era, the $1 million settlement back when such things were astonishing. And they sold the house to Frederick Vanderbilt, who lived there utterly quietly for the next decade, before selling it to Atwater Kent, who remodeled it again. And and that's pretty much Bar Harbor's sole Newport-style interior. All at Sonergy. And continuing on with the servant problem, this is Farview, built for Philip Livingston. It was purchased in 1936 by the mystery writer Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Commodore Livingston had fallen on hard days and was then employed as a floor walker at Macy's. And lovely house. Notice in the plan of the house that it's built around a courtyard. This becomes important in a moment. Mrs. Reinhardt had the house completely refitted. There she is, talking with architect and a daughter-in-law. Lovely courtyard in the center. And then she proceeded to be photographed for magazines, absolutely without stop, at her Bar Harbor house. And there she is with her chef, who was another loyal employee until the day she decided that she needed a butler as well as the chef and maids in Bar Harbor, hired a butler. It so unhinged the chef that he took a kitchen knife and started chasing her around the house. And the house being, it was quite a chase. And at some point she passed the front door on her way to try to bolt the door of the library, and a boy who was coming to interview for the job of second gardener showed up at the door, and Mrs. Reinhardt writes, "I'm sure I terrified him because I never saw him again, but I said, 'Young man, I can't talk to you right now. There's a man trying to kill me.'" Finally, her social secretary and her chauffeur managed to subdue him, and Mrs. Reinhardt went on to write a few more mysteries, including one that took place in the house. And she was, of course, considered in her day the American Agatha Christie, and her books were so carefully plotted and thought out, except that she forgot that if she had the murder happen while the power was out, that they couldn't take the body up in the elevator. So in subsequent editions, it had to be revised and mentioned that there was a separate circuit for the elevator. One of the constant themes I come across is that all the resorts, other resorts in the area, didn't want to be like Bar Harbor, but they hoped they would be. And Winter Harbor was one of them, but as I say, it all happened in 2 years. When the developer of Winter Harbor died, his widow left this house, and she hightailed it straight for Bar Harbor. She wasn't waiting at all to move on. This is her house, the house she bought in Bar Harbor, which was built by the son of the woman who built this house, Burton Harrison. More Soderholz. And that brings me to my endless interiors search again. In a Chicago Society column, lest you think I was only reading the New York Times, I found mention of the elegant drawing room the Charles Pikes, who by then owned the house, had, and filled with their wonderful mahogany. And since they were employed one of the best decorators in the history of the country, Francis Elkins, for their Chicago house, I had great hopes. Imagine my surprise when it turned out to be just another big, dumpy drawing room. But the views were lovely. Ogden Codman did work for the George Bowdens, but clearly not at their Bar Harbor house. This house, I'm sorry, this wasn't supposed to be here. This house is now in Lexington, Kentucky, but it used to be on West Street. The owner left town and moved it log by log. And we'll wrap up with one more servant problem. In the late 18 and early 1900s, Town Topics was the scandal sheet that absolutely nobody read, which of course means everybody did. And Colonel Mann, the publisher of Town Topics, made a much better living by receiving gifts for what he didn't publish than he ever did for... And he could and did ruin many a reputation when people refused to play. I got curious about how bad it really was, and I have no pair of glasses. The big surprise of being 60 is that there is never a right distance. And anyway, it seems harmless. He mentions that there were a lot of Philadelphians in Bar Harbor that particular summer and talks a little bit about light scandals, but it doesn't seem so bad. But he did worry Anne Archbold, the daughter of a Standard Oil treasurer, so much that when she built her house at Bar Harbor, which was designed not by an architect but by her sculptor friend Janet Scudder, she, and lovely, Mr. Soderholz once did the concrete work. A basic Gardner Museum sensibility that was so popular at the time. And there you see the dining room table. Do you notice it rests on a drum and that there's a hole in the center? Her solution to making certain that the servants weren't selling gossip picked up at table to town topics was to have a dumbwaiter installed in the center of the table, just like Mad Ludwig in Bavaria. And there's even a story, which I hope isn't apocryphal, which is that one day the table went down to the basement and stopped working, leaving the guests just faced with each other waiting for their next course. And it all ends, as always, with Bar Harbor Fire. This is the ruin of the Archbold house with a statue by Janet Scudder, who also designed the house. Oh, Mrs. Stotesbury, and her naughty son Jimmy Cromwell, who used to be married to Doris Duke. Finally, something I didn't mention is that between about 1890 and 1915, whoever the social columnist for the New York Times was really unhappy because she or he felt the second-rateness of Bar Harbor compared to Newport, and she was forever saying, oh dear, the Potter Palmers won't be here this summer, they're going to Newport instead, and there is no hope for the Bar Harbor season. Or, oh joy, the George Vanderbilts aren't spending this summer in Paris and they'll be here and we stand some chance of being as... I mean, the poor woman I keep saying woman, whoever it was, just was in a tizzy all the time when J.P. Morgan bought Great Head as a wedding gift for his daughter Louisa. The columnist got very excited and said, any minute, it's going to be the grandest house ever in Bar Harbor. It will take its rank with any house in Newport. And then the next summer it still hadn't happened. And she said, it is still to be hoped that the Satterleys will build a big, big house. And then the summer after that, she was sort of giving up. In the fourth summer, the Satterleys have decided quite stylishly to just build a series of bungalows there, making game front of it. But she also said the same thing about the E.T. Stotesburys. They bought Bar Island. She thought that they would be immediately building the most palatial house ever in Bar Harbor, and they didn't. And apparently Mrs. Stotesbury wasn't having anything with being on an island that you could only get to at high tide anyway, at low tide, excuse me. And so they instead bought the arts and crafts house of A.J. Cassatt. Mrs. Stotesbury, the biggest hostess of her day, was not one to live in an arts and crafts house, so she remodeled it. And she was also not one to settle on a scheme. The famous remark that's variously attributed to Coco Chanel or Diane Vreeland, elegance's refusal, was not in Mrs. Stotesbury's vocabulary. So this house is a sort of compendium of the greatest hits of New England federal architecture. Any famous building in New England, there's some little part of it that's been cribbed. I won't bore you today with the sources, but I can actually track every building that house was copied from. That's the ocean front before Mrs. Stotesbury and the ocean front after. Doesn't it? It was... And likewise the interiors, nice solid arts and crafts den in the Cassatt version of the house. And finally, but unfortunately I think the social columnist was dead by then because the tone of the columns was completely different. Finally, interiors of Newport style arrived in Bar Harbor and she would have been so happy. The Cassatt's stair hall, the same hall after the Stotesburys. Dining room, Stotesbury dining room. And the ballroom, which was copied from an English room, but two English rooms, one at Sion House and one at Home House in Portland Square by Robert Adam. There's the original. And the floor plan, which is the only time that Bar Harbor houses ever reached a sort of Downton Abbey degree. I mean, Mrs. Stotesbury had rooms that, for any possible service function that could be imagined, from making ice to wrapping packages to receiving packages, men's servants sitting rooms, women's servants sitting rooms, and you'll notice in the servants' wing there are two. But what amazes me, there are two entrances, and the men servants on the next two floors were careful, a solid wall between the two wings. In fact, I got so used to that imagine my surprise when I found a house in Seal Harbor where the butler's room was on the same corridor as the maids' rooms. Mrs. Stotesbury's house didn't have coherence. One would enter under the porte cochere here and go on a long process down this arcade, hang a right, down this arcade, down this hall, and across this hall, through the reception room, onto the thing. And if you were having tea with Mrs. Stotesbury, you weren't finished yet. You continued on and down this arcade and wound up. So even though your driver had let you off over here, 100 feet away, you had traversed through more of Mrs. Stotesbury's house than you probably ever wanted to see. And again, the problem of what to do afterwards. In 1946, Mrs. Stotesbury died, and the next owner had plans drawn up to tear down the middle of the house and convert the two wings. This is Robert Patterson's design for doing that. But in 1947, the Bar Harbor fire came and swept everything away, and no one was in the mood to build a house, and the ferry terminal now sits there, and I'm done. Thank you.